Hello, and welcome to the ninth week of the Atlantic Abolition and Slavery module. This week, we're going to be looking at how the slave trade began to slowly be abolished in Britain. Last week, we saw how France abolished slavery first in Haiti, then throughout all of its empire, albeit not necessarily for moral reasons. And this week, we'll be looking at how Britain ends up doing the same. So, we want to begin with a very familiar relationship that we've seen on numerous occasions throughout this module: a slave owner and his slave. The two in question being a young slave by the name of James Somerset and a Scottish born American called Charles Stewart. Charles Stewart was moved to America when he was quite young and became a merchant and a customs officer. So, someone who would be engaged in mercantile proceedings would often need slaves, come into contact with slaves, and he purchased James Somerset when he was a 9-year-old child. However, when James Somerset was 19 years old, he was sent to England to help out Charles Stuart's sister, who had recently lost her husband. Now, when James Somerset was in England, he, like we've discussed before, became a Christian, and various churches and people from those churches liked him. They baptized him, they helped teach him to read and speak English. And Somerset became familiar with some of the early, really important abolitionist movements, and particularly Quakers, who were very involved with abolitionist movements throughout the 17th and 18th century. Now, Somerset, having educated himself, decides that he's going to escape the shackles of Charles Stewart, although by contemporary standards, Stewart had treated him quite well in terms of he had allowed him to become educated, he dressed him in fine clothes. However, Somerset wanted his freedom, and in October 1771, Somerset escapes. However, he's recaptured very quickly. He's only gone for about a month, and Charles Stewart, when he hears this news, is furious, and his plan is to send him back into the Americas, and he wants to sell him to a plantation on Jamaica. So he puts James Somerset on a ship, ready to be transported. However, some of the religious people, Anglicans who had come into contact with James Stewart, decided that they wanted to help him out, and including people who claimed to be Somerset's godparents, although there's some debate about whether they were or not. And essentially, whilst the ship is about to leave England, they arrive on it and they hand to the captain a writ of habeas corpus. Now, habeas corpus is basically a legal document that challenges a captor's ability to legally hold someone. So this goes to court. The captain is forced to release James Somerset, and this case really changes the direction and sentiment surrounding slavery in Britain. It's a very important case study because it essentially explores whether or not a person is property, whether a slave is a personal property, even. And the case attracts one of the finest legal minds in England at the time, who is also an abolitionist. And Granville Sharp is often forgotten behind the more famous name of William Wilberforce. But Granville Sharp he participates in a number of trials on behalf of slaves, and he does an enormous amount. for the abolitionist movement. This really stems from his religious upbringing, as many abolitionists in this time period were. Sharp was the son of the Archdeacon of Northumberland, and his father was a very regular theological scholar. He prints lots of stuff out, and he really believes in the equality of man. And Granville and his brothers and sisters are raised in this religious way, and that shapes his abolitionist thought. When he's young, his brother is actually a surgeon, specifically who deals with people who cannot afford surgery. And his brother is constantly coming into contact with and performing surgery on and giving medicine to slaves who've been beaten by their masters. And it is in this time period that the whole Sharp family really increasingly becomes involved in trying to help slaves in their everyday life, but also in wider legal movements. Sharp becomes a civil servant. So he gets to know the British legal system very well. And in 1769, not long before the whole Somerset Stuart tension, he publishes something called A Representation of the Injustice and Dangerous Tendency of Tolerating Slavery. So this book, and we've talked a lot about the importance of print culture and literacy rates and in the exchange of ideas. And from this time period onwards, other white abolitionists begin printing work as well. And Sharp strongly believes that there is basically no legal framework for slavery within Britain. In the case of France, in the Caribbean, we've spoken a lot about Le Code Noir, the Black Code that was an attempt to create a legal framework to justify slavery within the French Empire. That's never happened in Britain. In fact, there is just a vacuum legally surrounding the issue of slavery. And Granville Sharp, in a lot of his cases, basically argues that it is illegal to own someone because the British justice system doesn't specifically say that it is legal. And the Somerset case really is a turning point in this issue. It is literally a slave versus his master. And the person who presides over the court case is called Lord Mansfield, who is an incredibly unique and interesting individual. Mansfield had had a long and prestigious legal career. He had, in fact, also been a MP, and he had never particularly petitioned on the behalf of slaves or anything, but he had been noticeably sympathetic towards them. And this may stem from the fact that his nephew has a child with a slave in America, and his nephew sends this child, who is mixed race, to live with Mansfield. And she becomes known as Dido Bell, and I've put her in the top right picture. And she's loved by Mansfield's wife, especially. Now, she remains, in theory, a slave. She was born into slavery, but she was raised up as one of the family. So he has an interesting relationship and a personal connection to the slave trade. He's also a vicious critic of the legal system in Britain, which he believes is outdated. The 18th century is a time of enormous change in Britain. Cities are springing up, industrialization is taking place, and the legal system has never really been updated to represent that. And he, when he is made Lord Justice of England, introduces widespread reforms to the legal system. So this 1772 Somerset case is really a part of a larger update of the British legal system, which in large parts had been written after the Norman invasion. There were huge parts that had never been updated. Now, Mansfield and Granville had clashed in the court on many times, and Granville Sharp doesn't really think he has much chance, but his arguments are strong. And Mansfield comes up with the revolutionary finding that there was no legal basis for slavery. Nowhere in the British legal system does it say that it is legal to keep a slave. So Somerset is free. He cannot be transported to the Caribbean to be sold into slavery. Now, this finding is very much centered within Britain, within England and Wales especially, that there is no framework for slavery. The colonies and the rest of the empire is much more ambiguous, and they have their own sets of autonomy and legal frameworks. But in England, Mansfield decides that there is no basis for slavery. And this is really the beginning of a process over the next 50 and 60 years of the legal system making adjustments until slavery is eventually completely abolished. There's no one key moment where slavery just disappears. It is slowly but surely the legal system of Britain changes. And there's a couple of really important dates in that, which I'll go through this week and after Easter. And the kind of last 2 decades of the 18th century are characterized by these big trials, which kind of become a form of popular culture. They're in the newspapers and people follow them like a soap. And within a decade of that landmark case, the Somerset Stewart case, you have the Zong massacre, which we've spoken about a few times on this course, and the subsequent trial that happens in November of 1781. Just to remind you, the Zong is a slave ship, and it belonged to this Liverpool-based slave consortium and syndicate known as the Gregson Company. And as a slave syndicate, they have taken insurance out with insurance brokers on the contents of all of their ships. And the idea is that slaves are a part of that. They are covered by the insurance. Now, the Zong's journey is a deeply, deeply unpleasant one. The people in charge of it, the crew, make a number of navigational mistakes, which takes them as they're heading to the Caribbean, and it takes much longer than they're anticipating it to take. As a result of that, they begin running out of water. And what they decide is they're going to throw slaves overboard so that they don't run out of water. And in total, over 130 slaves, mostly women and children, because they wanted to keep the valuable men who would work in the plantations, are thrown overboard and drowned. This leads to a massacre on the ship where both crew and slaves are killed as a result. By the time that the Zong reaches the Caribbean, there is a minute amount of people left. This leads to this big legal case because the great Gregson Company back in Liverpool believed that the insurance company should pay out for the loss of people on the ship. The insurance company, however, refused to pay back, basically suggesting that it was murder. It was murder of people rather than by the crew, rather than the accidental loss of cargo. So you get this big trial, and it takes place in London over whether or not murder had taken place, or whether the insurance should pay out on the cargo being people. So are they people or are they property? And what happens is the courts side basically with the Gregsons, suggesting that the people, the slaves on board, are property and that the insurance company should pay out for them, essentially absolving the crew of the Zong of murder. Now, this causes actually a moral outrage in Britain, especially within religious circles, especially within kind of educated elite of the country, and free former slaves. And this is where you start to get satirical cartoons appearing in newspapers and artwork depicting the evils of slavery. I've included one of them on this slide of two white men torturing a black woman on a ship. So this, the Zong massacre in particular, provides a catalyst for the increase in abolitionist movements, especially from religious white groups. And it is in the 80s, the decade following the Zong trial, that you get a variety of abolitionist groups forming. One of the most prominent of which is, and early ones, is called the Clapham Sect, which is established by an Anglican vicar called Henry Venn, who I've included on the left hand side of this screen. And really importantly, and a name you'll be familiar with, this group includes William Wilberforce, who I've included on the right of this screen. And it has really important members, including Granville, the lawyer I've already talked about, as well as Thomas Clarkson. And it's really their religious beliefs that make them do this. They call themselves crusaders, and their opponents actually kind of rather mockingly call them the saints, almost what we would call conservative commentators might call virtue signalers. Now, so this group of religious individuals, wealthy, influential individuals who have ties to the political elite of the company, really begin a sustained campaign to improve the lives of slaves and abolish slavery. Now, Wilberforce is often singled out as one of the most important of the saints, because he was an MP himself, and in Parliament he often raised the issue and tried to introduce bills to abolish slavery. So he was really important because he was part of the establishment. He was part of the politics of the country. Therefore, he had the power to do something. So those links were really important. But this is just one of many groups that form. There are women's societies, there are free former slaves, and the most famous group of former slaves and abolitionists are called the Sons of Africa. Again, this is a group I've mentioned before, so I'm not going to linger on them too much because during the slave narratives lecture, I discussed them at length and in the seminar. But they are former slaves living in London, including Equiano being one of the most important ones. And another really important former slave is Ottobah Cugoano, who works for a number of really prominent artists, most notably Richard and Maria Cosway. And they make links with really cultural, politically, and economically big people, important people within England. And Equiano, especially, he's articulate. He marries a white woman. He becomes part of British society. And their links to the saints, who have links to politicians, this movement gains traction throughout the 1780s and 1790s. And in 1787, this kind of conglomerate group of all these separate different abolitionist groups, called the Sons for Effecting the Abolition of Slavery, is created. So the separate movements kind of start to join as they gain momentum. And the methods in which they are trying to implement change and produce political pressure are really through print culture, pamphlets, articles, petitions, but there are lectures as well. Various kind of coins and medallions and collectible pieces are produced. It really becomes a cultural movement. And of course, rallies are really important. Large groups of people in London, especially, near the policymakers, trying to create physical um, a physical change and demonstrate the anger around this issue. But that's not the only methods they employ. They also do things outside of England. The most radical idea is really introduced in 1787, where these rich white religious men and former slaves try and create a former slave colony, and they buy land in what is now modern day Sierra Leone. Um, and they basically send ships of former slaves and poor black people to start a new society away from Britain where they wouldn't be um, subject to the slave trade. And this is a really popular idea with former slaves because they want autonomy, but with these white rich men, abolitionists, because they feel like they're doing something really significant, but also with pro slavery groups and Prime Minister William Pitt, because Pitt just sees this as an opportunity to get rid of black people from England. And the province of Freedom and Freetown, which still exists in Sierra Leone, is established, but it's really not a success, this colony, because other African tribes and local leaders wage war against them. Disease kills a lot of people because they weren't born in Africa. They might have been descended from Africans, but lots of them were actually born in the Caribbean. So disease kills them. They're biologically different now, and they don't have the same biological kind of defense to a lot of the diseases in Africa. And by 1792, there's only 64 people living in the colony. So this is a bit of an embarrassing disaster for the Sons of Africa, as well as the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor. But the following year, this movement continues to gain momentum back in England. And you have the first real change in the British law system. So the Somerset case is important because it freed a slave. It ruled that a slave could not be forced against his will back over to the Caribbean. But the 1788 Slave Trade Act, which is otherwise known as Dolben's Act, is the first change of British law that seeks to improve the lives of slaves. So it's a minor but important change that is part of this incremental process. So in 1788, a MP who is sympathetic to the abolitionist cause takes a group of MPs to the River Thames and goes on board a ship that is being fitted for a slave voyage. And this is shocking to many of the MPs, who have often been completely separated from these issues that they are debating. And as a result of this, and a mixture of Dolben and Wilberforce, who were MPs, they convinced Prime Minister Pitt for a debate about the abolition of slavery. Now, it's really important to acknowledge Wilberforce wants slavery to be completely abolished. Dolben is more moderate and really just wants to improve the conditions on slave ships, which he described as barbaric. There's still a lot of pushback against this, especially from Liverpool MPs, because of the Liverpool economy is so heavily based on slavery. But what happens in the 1788 Slave Trade Act is conditions on the slave ships are marginally improved. So before the Dolben Act, you could have 2.7 slaves per ton of the ship. This is reduced by almost 2/3 to you can have one slave per ton of the ship. And the conditions had to be improved. And actually, during the 1790s, you see the mortality rates on the slave ships drastically reduce. There are also incentives offered to the captains of ships for the higher percent of the slaves that survive the journey, they will be given money or other goods and services. Um, and compared to like the Dutch, where you don't get this act, their mortality rates remain high. So this improves the life expectancy of slaves, but slave trade continues to exist outside of England. As I mentioned earlier, the Somerset case really is focused on England rather than the empire. Um, and after this, pressure continues, and slowly but surely, these new acts are introduced. Wilberforce in 1791, so a couple of years after the Dolben Act, um, puts a bill to the MPs suggesting that slavery is completely abolished, that improving the conditions on the ships isn't enough. They need to get rid of the trade completely. But that is defeated by 163 votes to 88. So you can still see there is enormous amount of support for the slave trade to continue. And but in 1796, after another election, the demographic changes and you get more and more abolitionists as MPs. By 1807, you get 40 of the so called saints in Parliament who see this as their kind of crusade. In 1796, MPs vote that the slave trade should be abolished, but it doesn't move through the House of Lords. So it has to get through both houses. And this is the problem with the English legal system, that the House of Lords still remains more conservative than the initial chamber that it has to pass through. And there is still pushback from elements who want there to be a transition rather than the complete abolition of slavery. And that's what 1807 is. 1807 is essentially a compromise, because what you have is the slave trade. The trade of slaves is made illegal. So you can no longer buy or sell slaves. And there are punishments introduced for people who try to trade the slaves that they own. So £100 per slave that you are trying to trade, that is the punishment if you are caught. And actually, an entire squadron of ships patrols around England and the northwest coast of Africa. It's called the West African Squadron, to enforce this rule. And 150,000 slaves are actually taken away from the illegal act of the slave trade. What is important to note, though, this is not the abolition of slavery as a whole. If you own a slave, that is fine in Britain. It is the exchange and selling of slaves that becomes legal. So there are still hundreds of thousands of slaves. You simply, after 1807, can no longer trade them. So it is a big moment, but it is not the abolition of slavery as a whole. So you can see in the second half of the 18th century, these legal cases lead to changes in the legal system. And slowly but surely, things are incrementally changed. But it's the reasons why this process takes place, is not universally accepted. For a long time, the historiography of England championed the white abolitionists as the sole reason these issues take place. And Wilberforce becomes a hero to many historians and championed as a hero of Britain. However, Eric Williams, who was actually the first president of Trinidad and Tobago, and a very important historian, contradicts this idea. He said that it was not moral reasons, it wasn't the abolitionists' vigor that changed the mind of Parliament, but economic issues, that the sugar industry was on the decline, that The Haitian Revolution we discussed last week, and slave revolts that were on the increase in the Caribbean meant that it was no longer financially viable to keep slavery going. I spoke to you at length about how costly Britain's invasion of Haiti was. The idea Eric Williams gives is that it was economic reasons, not because of the abolitionists. Some historians agree with him, some don't. And I'd like you to think about this before the seminar because I'd like to get your opinion on it. Was it economic or was it moral reasons that slavery was adopted, began to be abolished? So we'll discuss that in the seminar. My main points are on this slide, so you can pause and read them at a later date. And before you get to the seminar, I'd like to read William Cotter's article, The Somerset Case and the Abolition of Slavery in England, so you can get a better idea of the intricacies of that case. That is in History Journal, volume 79, number 255, which was produced in February 1994. It's available on JSTOR, but I'll put the link on Moodle as well. And then I want you to think about the following 4 questions. 1, why did Lord Mansfield rule in favour of Somerset? And what was the impact of this case? 2, why did Granville Sharp and the Saints want to abolish slavery? What was in it for them? 3, who was more influential in the abolition of the slave trade, the Sons of Africa or the Saints? And then 4, is Eric Williams correct to conclude that 1807 Act was about economics rather than morals? I look forward to discussing these issues with you in the seminar next week. Thank you very much.